My name is Michael Gilmartin, and I'm currently the president of the Society for the Preservation of the Tripp Family Homestead. We are an organization that preserves, presents, and provides for the maintenance of the Tripp Family Homestead here in the North Scranton section of our city. It's a house that's been in the Lackawanna Valley for over 200 years. The first Isaac Tripp came here from Connecticut at the encouragement of business people to come into this area, which at that time was virgin woods that was teeming with game, to establish settlements, establish residencies, and then have do trade, do business with people in New England, particularly in the area of animal pelts. And this occurred in the late 1700s when Isaac Tripp I came up the Lackawanna River and observed cultivated fields nearby where he felt was an indication that the Indians who were living in the territory at the time would be friendly, and it prompted him to stop and come off the river up to this site, and he established a log cabin which has been confirmed that was on this site, and it was considered by most to be the first house or the first residence in the Scranton area at that time. The house was later enlarged and improved subsequently by Isaac II and Isaac III, and the fourth generation of Tripps that lived here was Ira and his wife Rosanna Tripp, who were here until about 1899. Upon the death of her husband, Rosanna left the house, and it continued to be a residence for families well into the 20th century, but no longer under the presence of the Tripp family. But we're fortunate that the house, although it became very deteriorated and run down probably in the 50s into the 60s, because so much development was happening in the suburbs, that the house was on the verge of being taken down by the city of Scranton, by the Redevelopment Authority. At that time, a volunteer women's organization, the Junior League of Scranton, was in a position and had the interest to establish a permanent office, a permanent location for the volunteer work that they did. And a Tripp descendant, a man named George Broadbent, whose mother was a Tripp, approached the Junior League and offered them assistance in what he could do to help them restore the house. And they agreed. They made a commitment with their organization and began to raise money in various ways, some public, some private, to restore the house. And by 1980, 1981, the restoration was completed, and much of what you see today is a result of that work by the Junior League of Scranton. The Junior League held ownership of the house for a period of almost 21, 22 years, and during that amount of time their membership changed, and the members, the current members were really stressed to maintain the financial commitment to the house. The organization membership was a bit smaller after a period of 20-some years, and they wanted to do other things than just be responsible to maintain the house. So a reorganization took place, and through the efforts of some of the sustaining members of the Junior League of Scranton, a new organization was formed, the membership was broadened, and the house has been under the ownership of the society with a volunteer board of directors in place to maintain and run the house as a venue for entertaining. It becomes a public house. People can rent the facility to have private parties such as a small wedding, bridal shower, rehearsal dinner, christening parties, birthday parties, things of that nature. It's well suited to events under 100 people. And that provides an income for the house, which generates an operating budget. In addition to fundraising efforts that the society does, and we also have income on the second floor of the house where the Junior League still maintains an office and pays rent to do that. There is an office rented by a community organization known as Scranton Tomorrow, which pays a rent to maintain an office on the second floor. And there is a tenant that lives in an apartment that was carved out during the restoration period, so that there's a presence on the house on a day-to-day basis as well. So the second floor also generates an income. Altogether, that helps us to maintain the property, which is a challenge. A wood house in the Northeast requires a lot of maintenance and upkeep, and it helps us to keep the oldest existing house in Lackawanna County a presence in our community. The room behind me is the main dining room, which during the time that the Tripps lived here would be probably most often used for entertaining large numbers of people rather than just the family. It was a room that probably didn't contain a great deal of furniture, but would be able to be outfitted with some tables, sometimes just boards held up by wooden sawhorses, and then covered with linens if the family was going to entertain. The room will seat 60 people. You can see that it's outfitted with round tables. Our chairs are, when they're not in use, we keep them up on top for convenience and for housekeeping responsibilities. But we have a period wooden folding chair that's used to allow seating of up to 60 people in this room. Now, because this is a federal-style house that was embellished with Victorian detail during the late 1800s, this room maintains the federal style, particularly through the lighting fixtures, which are Williamsburg-style chandelier in the center of the room, accented by side light wall sconces on three sides of the room. The north side of the room has a fireplace, which is the mantle is currently in the Italianate style. It's a marble mantle, and it's outfitted with a shallow hearth, because while the original fireplaces in the house would have burned wood, when anthracite coal was discovered in the area and used for the industrialization of not only the local area but a great deal of the country that were burning anthracite coal for a source of heat, the hearths were outfitted with a metal hearth, which was a little more shallow than it would have been originally, and large chunks of anthracite coal would have been placed in a grate and ignited to generate heat. The metal hearth, as it would become warm from the burning coal, would generate and radiate more heat into the room. I'm standing now in the small dining room, which is just beyond the main dining room. And it was a room that would provide an opportunity for the men to socialize after dinner or after an event that was brought people together at the house, for an opportunity to maybe talk a little business, smoke cigars, or have a brandy, while the women would retire most likely to the parlor and play card games or perhaps do needlepoint for a time before the evening was concluded. The small dining room augments our seating capacity. It can hold another 20 to 30 people, or it can be used in a variety of ways at a social event taking place in the house. The mantle in this room is a wood mantle, which was actually given to us by a donor, Gerard Jacquinot, who was working at the Pinchot estate in the early 1960s, I believe in about 1963. And the house, the Pinchot estate was being worked on. This mantle was removed, and he was the right person in the right place at the right time, took possession of it because it was going to be disposed of, and while he used it himself for a number of years, he ultimately donated it to the Tripp house and installed it in this room for us so the mantle would be completed. Previous to that, there was no mantle found on the Tripp property that would have been here. And the mantles were removed at a time in which the house had been changed in its interior use, because after World War II, when there was a need for housing for people coming back from Europe after the war, the house was actually divided into smaller apartments. These large rooms were often divided in half. Partitions were put up, the fireplaces, the mantles were removed, and the fireplaces were boarded up with wallboard. There was also a two-story addition on the back side of the house that was removed when the house was restored by the Junior League, of course, because it was not original. But at one time there were 7 apartments on the property, which provided living conditions for small families who were often working in the city in some capacity. And it wasn't until the suburbs developed, as I mentioned earlier, that the use of the house in that way began to become unnecessary, and the property ended up vacant. And that's when its deterioration began to take place into the 1950s and 1960s. We're now in the dining room, which was actually a later addition to the house. Remember, the house in its first presence was a very small log cabin, and then the house was subsequently enlarged at 3 different times during its history by Isaac II and Isaac III. And the dining room was a later addition that was put on the house. First it was a smaller square room, but the bay window was an addition that was put on during the late 1800s when the Tripps employed some builders that were brought here from Connecticut and made improvements, interior improvements to the house, and the bay window area was put on at that time. The dining room in May of 2015 was dedicated to honor Gene Michael Reese, who is a sustaining member of the Junior League and was one of the significant members of a small committee of Junior League sustainers who formed the Society for the Preservation of the Tripp Family Homestead. And we refer to this in her honor as the Reese Dining Room here at the Tripp House. The room is further enhanced by a Victorian-style large buffet mirror, side lights that were typically Victorian. They're candlesticks that are embellished with crystal drops, and it's reminiscent of the chandelier over the dining room table, which is a Victorian's reproduction of the type of chandelier that would have been here first using gas light, and now, of course, using electricity. The walls behind me shows 4 Audubon prints of North American wildlife that were a series of prints that James Audubon did, and we have 4 that were a gift to the house by a Junior League member in honor of her mother. Okay, we're now in the parlor of the house, which is to the right of the hallway. And it's a room that would provide comfort and enjoyment to the family on a daily basis in the evening. If they weren't entertaining, this is a room that they would spend time in to enjoy each other's company, play with the animals that they had in the house, because they did have dogs, and enjoy artwork and pictures, paintings and different things that they were particularly fond of. The room does have a fireplace with a Victorian grate that would burn chunks of coal. It has a few pieces of period furniture from the Victorian era. We have 2 marble tops and a sofa and some side chairs as well that would have provided some comfort to the family. And I mentioned earlier, this is where the ladies would come to socialize after a larger gathering of people, while the men were in the back dining room enjoying cigars and brandy. The women would visit and talk and enjoy each other's company here. Being that it was a smaller room, it was more comfortable for the family to be at home by themselves in the evening, closer to the fireplace, rather than to heat up a much larger room. I mentioned earlier that 4 generations of Tripps lived on the property during the early history of Scranton, and the 4th generation was in the presence of Ira and Rosanna Tripp, who lived here during the Victorian era. Ira Tripp was a soldier in the Civil War. He was imprisoned in the South for a while, and upon his return home and moving into the Victorian era, which was really generated by the English aristocracy, they were attracted to the Victorian style of architecture and embellished the home, both on the inside and the outside, with very typical Victoriana accoutrements to living that were popular at the time. Ira and Rosanna had 4 children, and their eldest daughter, Gertrude, during her 20s, her early 20s, was injured very seriously in a horseback riding accident that took place on the property. And it was during her convalescence that the room behind me was put onto the house. Previously, the house ended where I'm standing in this doorway, but a doorway was put on both sides of the fireplace. And the room behind me, which is a sunroom, and it's accented by large floor-to-ceiling windows that would allow Gertrude an opportunity to rest and convalesce and enjoy the outside, enjoy the gardens that she was very fond of, see the animals that were part of the property and that were important in the family business because they were into animal husbandry in both beef cattle and horses. Unfortunately, she lived for a time, but due to complications of her accident, she did pass away, and her funeral was attested in the paper as one of the largest and most prominent funerals in the city at that time. You're also seeing a cutout into the wall above the mantel in the parlor, which shows some detail of the fact that the house was a hand-built house with beams that were harvested and cut and then honed to be used in the construction of the house. This is a hand-built house that is representative of mortise and tenon joinery, which is shown here as well as on the second floor and can be actually seen in the attic. where the beams are tied together at the peak of the roof.